So now what happens next is agriculture arises about 12,000 years ago, and it arises in the fertile valleys of Persia. And the grain then spread out to Europe, and they go further east, and they come to Africa. And the reason why we adopted grains is not absolutely clear, but the probability is that we ran out of fatty animals. Because when humans first arrived on North America or in Australia, the first animals that they decimated were the fattest animals. For example, the mammoths. They were wiped out by humans. Within 2,000 years, they wiped out all the mammoths because they were such effective hunters. So anyway, the point is that agriculture comes along. But what's interesting for South Africa is, where did maize come from? If maize is a staple, where did it come from? And the answer is, it came from South America. Here's maize. So maize, which becomes the dominant food of the Southern Africans, how does it get from here to here? And when does it arrive? And the answer is, it arrives in about 1500. The Portuguese bring it to the East Coast. And it's adopted by the local peoples as a part of their staple, not everything, but a part of their staples. And I'll show you how it develops further and becomes the staple for South Africans. So however did maize, which originated in Central America, become a staple food in South Africa? And here's the story. And this article is in your discovery. And there's the title. And this is how it begins. It seems that black South African farmers, and that would have been on the East Coast, embraced the flowery and flint mazes on the farms long before white settlers did. Even at the end of the 19th century, white South African farmers still argued that maize was and I've removed the word there, crop, with little commercial value. In South Africa's largest maize growing area in 1914, the Orange Free State, only 2.25% of the province's area was planted to the crop, mostly by black sharecroppers. Only with the arrival of the next variety of maize, the American white dent variety Hickory King, and its local descendants, did white farmers take to maize as a major cereal crop. And then only after black African farmers had begun to exploit its usefulness and profitability. So by 1914, maize was not being grown to any great extent in South Africa as a staple food. So we have this incredible situation in South Africa that what we call the staple food was not the staple food before 1914. So the question is, what was the staple food before 1914? And unfortunately, I can't answer that question, but it's a question that has to be answered. So then we carry on. Another quite different maize-led transformation took place in Southern Africa in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now remember, that is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in South Africa, is in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it was part of the mining revolution and the industrialization that spiraled out from the Kimberley diamonds and the Witwatersrand gold urban demands for food supplies to sustain mine labor. The evolution of a distinct agricultural landscape, the region of the Transvaal, the Eastern Orange Free State, and colonial Basutoland, now Lesotho, was known as the Maize Triangle. But where did it come about? It came about because of the Industrial Revolution in South Africa. And that was the historical conjuncture of maize, labor migration, the nascent industrial capitalism on the South African highveld based on the mining industry. And so by the 1930s and 1940s, the paths of the rural economies crossed and took very different trajectories. Black farms had ceased to produce food crops for the market and relied on maize as subsistence, but white farms, by contrast, had grown in scale. And why had they grown in scale? Because the government of the day realized that they didn't want to import maize from Lesotho, which was the main producer of maize in southern Africa. They said, why can't we just grow it here in South Africa ourselves? And so they started to offer credit and extension in markets through price control and government programs. In mining towns and marketing centers like Bloemfontein, Maseru, Harrismith, Bethlehem, and Potchefstroom organized both markets for maize and the distribution of new crop varieties and equipment. So the introduction of this new Hickory King and the industrial milling encouraged monocropping and eventually the mechanization of maize farming. So when we talk about maize being the staple food in Southern Africa, we have to understand how it got there. It was a decision by the South African government to produce maize on an industrial scale to undermine the production of Lesotho so that we could benefit from the sale of maize and provision of maize to our people in southern Africa. And the question is, well, was that good for our people or not? And that's the question that we have to answer. So there we go. I think I made the point. Since the 1950s, government subsidies from South African mine-based economy allowed white farmers to invest in tractors, harvesters, etc., 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 and so that they were then able to produce Bruce maize. So now the question is, and we're going to go through the South African Dietary Guidelines. The South African Dietary Guidelines are based on the premise that as maize is a staple food of the majority of South Africans, high carbohydrate diets should be prescribed as the healthy option for all South Africans. And that's the point I'm going to make. And maybe it's an extension of the argument, but I will give evidence that seems to be the bias of the evidence that was led. This advice completely ignores the evolutionary history, most of it occurring in South Africa, of how humans became human as a result of changes in what they ate. And what we need desperately in South Africa is someone to go and write the history of the 3 million years of nutrition in Southern Africa. And then we will understand the nuances of how we got to where we are today, and how perhaps it was the introduction of maize and making this a staple food which has been a problem for us. And I'll argue that in due course. Michael Eads, who in fact he's an American writer and who was actually here at the first day on Monday, he wrote this book in the 1990s after he converted to the low carbohydrate diet. And Dr. Eads wrote this book, Protein Power, which was published in the 1990s. And in it, he was asked, so why did you adopt the low carbohydrate diet? And he said, well, it's simple. I looked at the people who were following the current dietary guidelines 3,000 years ago. And I said, how healthy were they? So it turns out that the Egyptians were the first people in the world to eat the diet that we're told to eat today. So they're a fabulous test case of the diet. We don't even have to do the diet. We just go and see, were the Egyptians healthy? Because look at this. They ate the diet that fulfills the South African Dietary Guidelines. The Egyptian diet consists primarily of bread, cereals, fresh fruits, vegetables, some fish and poultry, almost no red meat, olive oil instead of lard, and goat's milk for drinking, and made into a cheese. A veritable modern nutritionist nirvana. That's it. If I'm told what's a healthy diet, that's it. If such is the ultimate healthy diet, rich in all the foods believed to promote health and almost devoid of saturated fat and cholesterol and refined sugar, then according to Dr. Eads, the ancient Egyptians should have lived forever, at least should have lived long, healthy lives and died of old age in their beds. But did they? So here they are, and that shows that they were a bread or grain-based population. That is the preparation of bread and grains. And here's someone producing grains for bread. And they were so fond of bread that they were known as the autophagio, or eaters of bread. So bread was crucial to the Egyptians. And there they are, and on the bottom you can see other fruits and grains. So this was their diet. Primary carbohydrate, bread, fruits, vegetables, honey, oils, olive, flaxseed, safflower, sesame, fish, waterfowl, occasional red meat. No saturated fat, all the healthy foods that you'd hope for. And this is what they looked like. And you can see that they're obese, and they have what I'm going to introduce you to later as a thing called the insulin roll. This shows that these people are insulin resistant, eating high carbohydrate diets. And Dr. Eads, and I'll just call it, he calls these man boobs. I apologize for that, but that's what he described. And that's the characteristics of people with insulin resisting eating a high carbohydrate diet. And this is what their teeth looked like. And really, teeth tell you the health of the people and the health of the population. And these are not healthy teeth. And we'll show you how cereals and grains contribute to poor teeth quality. And so then the first definition of a heart attack is in the Ebers Papyrus of 1550 BC. In medicine, we teach that someone else in Britain probably was the first person to ever describe a heart attack, but it's actually here. If thou examinest a man for illness in his heart, cardia, chest, and he has pains in his arms and in his breast, and we know that chest pain radiates down, heart pain radiates down the left arm, and in his breast and in one side of his cardia, it is death threatening him. So there's the diagnosis. This guy's got heart disease, and it's presenting as angina pectoris or as myocardial infarction. And here, now this is a stretch of imagination, but here's a guy dying suddenly, and so this could be the first picture, you probably can't see it, of a guy dying suddenly, and it was so important that they even had it in relief. And the pathology of the Egyptians was studied by Dr. Raffa in 1911, and published in 1911. And he says, I cannot therefore at present give any reason why arterial disease should have been so prevalent in ancient Egypt. So why can't he? Because his model doesn't fit, because he's thinking that they shouldn't have had the disease because they ate differently from us. I think, however, it's interesting to find that it was a common, that 3,000 years ago, it represents the same anatomical characteristics as it does now. So the Egyptians 3,000 years ago had the same arterial disease that we have today, and which is the key feature of diabetes as we described. So Dr. Eads continues, so a picture begins to emerge of an Egyptian populace rife with disabling dental problems, fat bellies, and crippling heart disease. Sounds a lot like the afflictions of millions of people in America today, doesn't it? The Egyptians didn't eat much fat, had no refined carbohydrates, and ate almost nothing but whole grains, fresh fruits and vegetables, and fish and fowl, yet were beset with all the same diseases that afflict modern man. Modern man who is exhorted to eat lots of whole grains, fresh fruit and vegetables to prevent or reverse these diseases. Eads concludes that this historical evidence might suggest that there are some real problems with the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. So that's some of the evidence, but there's other evidence as well, and this is the brain sizes. What's happened to brain sizes since we started eating grains? So if we go back to 10,000 years ago, and this is when we first start eating grains, and these are fossils that have been discovered between 5,000 years and modern times, or modern times obviously they would be in modern humans, and you can see that the brain size in men has gone from 144 to 138, and in women from 141 to 132. So the trend is downwards. If you look at stature, and I haven't got those graphs, our human stature drops dramatically after we start eating grains, and we really only catch up in the last 100 years, do we get back to where we were 12,000 years ago. So we see that when we introduce grains into our society, two things definitely happened. Our brains got smaller, and we got smaller. And we only got bigger again more recently. So human brains have been getting progressively smaller over the past 10,000 years since the introduction of agriculture, the eating of grains, and the avoidance of fish and other animal produce, particularly in the weaning diet, I might add. So in 1930, this book was written, and this is one of the key books in nutrition, and it talks about the nutrition transition in a way that no other book does, and it's called The Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston Price. And it was completely lost. So what Weston Price did was, in 1930, he was a dentist in the United States, and he noticed that the children's teeth were getting worse, and he wondered why. And he said, I'm going to find out why, and I'm going to go and look at what people were eating in the past and what was the health of their teeth. And for 10 years, he and his wife traveled the world, taking pictures of so-called primitive, by that I mean people who were isolated, continued to live exactly as they had always lived. And we will show these people are far from primitive. They are more knowledgeable about nutrition than we are by a long way. So he went, for example, he went all over the world to find isolated populations which had not been tarnished with eating the modern industrial diet. And he noticed a couple of things. So in Africa, he saw the Congo and the Maasai, and in Australia and New Zealand, he saw the New Zealand Maori. And he noticed a couple of things, and those pictures show that these people have perfect teeth. And they also have very broad faces. And their teeth are in perfect alignment, and they have absolutely perfect arches. But as soon as the modern industrial diet came, that's what happened. And their teeth were destroyed. Now this man is going to die because he's going to get infections in his sinuses, and they're going to go to brain abscesses. So we know that humans could not have survived if this was the natural way we looked. We could only survive with good teeth. So whatever these people were doing was good for their health, and what these people were doing was bad for their health. And so that's the book he wrote, and I've given you in the discovery the most important chapter describing the health of the people that he met. And you'll see these pictures, that all these fabulous wide faces and perfect teeth. And that will tell you that these people are eating the same foods they've always eaten. No industrial diet at all. And he said, he concluded, like the Indian, the Eskimo thrived as long as he was not blighted by the touch of modern civilization. But with it, like all primitives, and the word again is not right, he withers and dies. So he recognized that these populations, isolated populations, did extremely well and were perfectly healthy. And that included populations in Europe. There was a Swiss population had been isolated for centuries. They lived on cows and cow dairy produce, and that was it. And they were incredibly healthy. And these were the diseases which were absent in those populations: dental caries, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, most cancers, and these conditions. And so if you were to look and say, well, what changed and what caused all these diseases to become apparent, you can say one possibility is that we change our diets. It's a possibility, but we don't consider it. We just ignore it. And that's my frustration. If we knew the literature, if we read his book, we have to ask the question, where did these diseases come from? And that is my conclusion. These diseases of civilization or urbanization are nutritionally based. The reason we don't accept it is because we can't comprehend that the primitives knew better than we do what to eat for optimal health. But they had better options. They had this fabulous foods. But we live in an environment, toxic food environment at present. And that might be the explanation. So the example I love to give is the Plains Indians in America. And they borrowed the horses from the Spaniards, and they became expert bison hunters. And as a consequence, they were amongst the tallest people in the world in the 1830s. And there are 4 so-called tribes, and they are taller even than the Australians. And you have to remember that the Australians were tall because they took the merino sheep from Cape Town with them, and that's what they lived on. So they scored also on height. But height is considered the key marker of health. So despite eating a diet which was completely animal-based, these people did extremely well. And the first man who went west of the Mississippi, George Catlin, met these 2 guys, 6'7" and 6'6". And he must have been a bit frightening. But the point is, they were eating no grains, or very few grains, but predominantly animals. Buffalo was all they ate. And this is a book, again, which I've read, and this is described by one of the scouts in that group that was wiped out. He survived, Custer's last stand. And this is what he said about the people that wiped out Custer. They were all keen, athletic young men, tall and lean and brave, and I admired them as real specimens of manhood more than any body of men I'd ever seen before or since. They were perfectly adapted to their environment and knew just what to do in every emergency and when to do it without any confusion or lost motion. Their poise and dignity were superb. No royal person ever had more assured manners. I watched their every movement, etc., etc., etc. And so that's what these people looked like in those days. They were tall, powerful, strong, lean. And what did we do? We went and wiped out the bison. And what happened then? That's what happened. Yeah. And so then we asked the question, what's the cause of obesity in Plains Americans? And the cause is obvious, but we won't address it. And so we spend millions of dollars every year trying to explain what happened. And we don't accept that the reason is obvious. And I argue that the same applies to most populations where obesity suddenly appears within a generation or two. It's because they changed the diet from what they'd historically been eaten for centuries or thousands of centuries, and they change it to the modern industrial diet. So let's move to South Africa and see, are there any stories that any information that we can learn? And there are. there are two major stories, and the one is the Rondebosch. In fact, there are three stories. The Rondebosch arrives in Africa in 1887. It comes through Somalia, and it goes through southern Africa between 1896 and 1897. And it decimates the cattle in South Africa. And this is what effect on the native African populations. With the disappearance of the source of meat and milk, Africans experienced considerable hardship and in some cases starvation. The impoverishment of Africans caused by Rondebosch contributed to the process of labor migration, because these people now had to move to the cities where they met the white man's diet, for which they had not been prepared. And then there was the other tragedy, and I'm not going to pretend I know how to pronounce this Xhosa princess's name, but she ordered the Gakela to kill all their cattle in 1858. And so in return, she told her people that the spirits would sweep the British settlers into the sea, and the Xhosa would be able to replenish their granaries and fill the kraal with more beautiful and healthier cattle, etc. And so they estimated that they killed between 300 and 400,000 cattle, and in that produced in the Eastern Cape this massive famine as a result of that. So that's another example where the foodstuff, the animal foodstuff, was wiped out. But that's not all, because it gets perhaps even worse. Because in KwaZulu-Natal, the prided animal were the Nguni cattle. And the Nguni cattle were absolutely the devoted animals of the Zulu-speaking people. And it was estimated there were 5 million Nguni cattle in KwaZulu-Natal. It could have been said that so immense was the number of cattle that the kraal mud splashed up to heaven. But war, disease, political unrest, and the introduction by whites of their own cattle caused a decline in their numbers. And at the end of the 1879 Anglo-Zulu War, in which the power of the Zulu kingdom was broken, Sir Garnet Wolseley ensured the end of the Zulu royal herds by slaughtering and confiscating what remained. So the population that was dependent on these cattle suddenly had nothing to eat with the animals with which they had grown up. And then so if you want to look for the problems that we have in obesity and diabetes in South Africa, you have to address these issues. And this is another example. These are the most obese populations in the world, and they're all islands in the Pacific. And why is that? Because these people have lived for centuries on fish and coconut oil and very little else. And they've adapted and been healthy. And as soon as the industrial diet arrives, they're not designed to eat it. And the sugar destroys them because they're insulin resistant, and they're put on a high carbohydrate diet. And then finally, a lot of people ask, well, Asians eat a lot of carbohydrates and surely they're healthy and so on. And here's a paper that was published in 2015 and also is in the Discovery. And it's a historical exploration of Indian diets and a possible link to the insulin resistance syndrome. And it's published and written by Manoshi Bhattacharya. And it's published in Appetite in 2015. And this lady doesn't have the data, but she looks at the historical story of what people reported they ate. And so the complaint is, but we actually didn't measure food frequency questionnaire in those people 3,000 years ago, so we don't actually know what they're eating. That's nonsensical. They reported what they ate. And this is the conclusion. The data presented shows a gradual shift over the centuries from the pastoral age diet of large quantities of high fiber carbohydrates, small amounts of digestible carbohydrates, moderate fats, and moderate proteins. So that is not a low carbohydrate diet. Absolutely accept that. And people can eat these diets if they're carbohydrate sensitive and they don't change and introduce sugar and highly refined carbohydrates. And also remove the fat. And the diet changes to an increase in frequent intake of high fiber carbohydrates with a significant drop in protein and fat consumption between 1775 and 1942. From 1942 onwards, there's been an increase of the frequency of intake and quantity of low fiber and refined carbohydrates with fat and protein intake improving only marginally. So her conclusion is that this population has become progressively more insulin resistant over 200 years as they've removed fat from the diet, they've removed protein, and they've replaced it not with healthy carbohydrates, but with more easily digested carbohydrates. So, having given you this story, I've tried to impress upon you that humans evolved over 300 years to eat what we eat today, to eat. And what we're eating today is very different from what we co-evolved with. And I've given you, because we're South Africans, there's a specific case in South Africa which hasn't been resolved. And that is, how did maize become such a dominant foodstuff? And what happened to populations that were eating, or at least they had herds of cattle, which provided other animal-based nutrients? And what is the history of our eating over the last period? So properly to understand what modern South Africans should be eating to be healthy, we need to understand how the diet of our peoples has changed over the past 3 million years, and not over the past 100 years or less. And my argument is that we are forcing South Africans to eat a diet which has evolved over the last 100 years and which is incompatible with our evolutionary history and what we are designed to eat.